Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a really fascinating ancient legal debate all about the scriptural rules for covering the blood. We're going to look closely at a text that functions a whole lot like a modern appellate court decision, where they carefully weigh competing methodologies for interpreting foundational laws. The level of analytical rigor here, it's truly remarkable. By tracking the logic step by step, we're going to see exactly how these ancient jurists built their arguments. To really get how these arguments work, we'll hit these 5 key areas on our roadmap: the ineffective slaughter dilemma, the verbal analogy of pouring, the condition of consumption, excluding the impure bird, and finally, the logical extension.
All right, Section 1, the ineffective slaughter dilemma. Let's set our baseline legal question.
So the baseline rule here is the requirement known as covering the blood. It's a direct scriptural command applied to undomesticated animals and birds. It's exactly what it sounds like, right? A procedural requirement to cover the blood with earth right after the act of slaughter. On the surface, it seems like a pretty straightforward procedural step. But as you'll see, the precise definition of what actually triggers this obligation is where the legal sparks really start to fly.
Now here's where it gets interesting. The core legal dilemma is this. What happens when an animal has a fatal defect, making it entirely unfit for consumption, rendering the slaughter ineffective? Does the obligation to cover the blood still apply? Think about the nuance for a second. The physical act of slaughter definitely occurred, but because of a pre-existing fatal defect, the legal outcome of that slaughter, making the meat permitted to eat, was not achieved. So is the obligation to cover the blood tied merely to the physical act, or is it inextricably linked to the legal success of that act?
Moving on to Section 2, the verbal analogy of pouring. Let's look at Rabbi Meir's stringent ruling and his textual proof.
Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish points out that Rabbi Meir gets to his strict conclusion that, yes, you still have to cover the blood by using a verbal analogy. This is basically a brilliant method of deriving legal precedent by linking 2 distinct texts. It's a super common and powerful interpretive tool in this framework. If the scripture uses a highly specific, identical term in 2 totally separate legal contexts, it's understood as a deliberate hyperlink. It literally allows the jurist to import the legal realities of one situation straight into the other.
Check out the textual connection Rabbi Meir makes here. On one side, regarding our primary topic of covering the blood, the text explicitly says, "And he shall pour out its blood." On the other hand, there's a totally different law regarding a sacrificial animal that is improperly slaughtered outside the designated temple courtyard. That text says, "He has poured blood." The shared anchor here is the concept and terminology of pouring.
So the big takeaway? Just like a sacrificial animal slaughtered outside the temple courtyard is absolutely unfit for consumption but still legally counts as a slaughter, the exact same standard applies to covering the blood. Because that improper slaughter outside the temple courtyard is explicitly recognized by the text as an act of slaughter, even though the meat is absolutely forbidden to eat, Rabbi Meir uses the verbal analogy to set a firm precedent. If an ineffective slaughter is legally recognized over there, the shared word pouring demands that we recognize an ineffective slaughter over here when it comes to covering the blood. It's an incredibly tight, structurally sound argument. But wait! We have Section 3, the condition of consumption. Enter Rabbi Shimon's opposing standard.
Rabbi Shimon completely pivots. He looks at the exact same rule but anchors his logic in a totally different part of the scripture. He counters by focusing directly on this specific scriptural phrase regarding covering the blood, which explicitly includes the condition, "that may be eaten." He essentially points to the very verse commanding the ritual and says, look at the qualifying language right here in front of us. It doesn't just say an animal or a bird. It specifies an animal or bird that may be eaten.
For him, this isn't just a suggestion, it's a clear textual mandate. Rabbi Shimon argues the obligation to cover the blood only kicks in if the slaughter actually results in meat that is fit for consumption. If the animal had a fatal defect and the slaughter was ineffective, well, the meat may not be eaten. Therefore, it fails the fundamental condition laid out in the text, and the obligation to cover the blood simply does not activate. It's a powerful counterargument because it relies on the plain, localized reading of the primary verse rather than building a bridge to a different law.
Which brings us to Section 4. Excluding the impure bird, where we interpret the limits of the scripture.
Now, Rabbi Meir can't just ignore that phrase, right? He has to deal with it in a way that doesn't destroy his verbal analogy. So he argues that the phrase, "that may be eaten," isn't a broad rule at all, but rather a super narrow exclusion meant only to exempt an impure bird from the ritual. Rabbi Shimon, of course, sees it as a universal condition. Rabbi Meir says, yes, the text says that may be eaten, but it's only there to teach us that species of birds which are inherently impure, and therefore never permitted to be eaten under any circumstances, are excluded from covering the blood. He's essentially trying to box the phrase in. He wants to limit its scope so that an animal of a pure species that just happens to have a fatal defect still requires the blood to be covered, keeping his earlier verbal analogy intact.
And that leads right into Section 5, the logical extension. This is Rabbi Shimon's ultimate rebuttal.
Let's walk through Rabbi Shimon's logical extension here, because it's absolutely brilliant. He essentially traps Rabbi Meir with his own defense. If we agree the text excludes the impure bird, we have to ask why. And the unavoidable answer is that it's unfit for consumption, meaning any animal with a fatal defect must be excluded for the exact same reason. He corners Rabbi Meir by asking, what is the underlying reason an impure bird is excluded? Because it's unfit for consumption. So, if the root rationale for exclusion is being unfit for consumption, you can't just arbitrarily limit that to an impure species. By definition, that exact same rationale must apply to an animal with a fatal defect, because it too is unfit for consumption. The logic just perfectly cascades down.
The sheer beauty of this analysis is how it shows that finding the root rationale for a single exception lets you build an entirely consistent, overarching legal framework. Rabbi Shimon doesn't just argue about what the words mean. He extracts the very DNA of the law. Once you identify that fitness for consumption is the operational mechanism behind excluding the impure bird, boom, you've discovered a universal principle. It forces consistency. You can't say the principle matters for the impure bird, but doesn't matter for the animal with a fatal defect. This debate over covering the blood and fatal defects isn't just some dusty artifact of ancient law. It's a literal masterclass in how to dismantle an argument by demanding pure consistency. So the next time you encounter a rule with an exception, ask yourself, what is the true underlying rationale for that exception? Because once you find it, you might just redefine the entire rule.